Should we start over? 1, 2, 3. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Crash course in Civil War intellectual conversations, or as we call it, crash course in the 160th of the Tennessee campaign. We are going to talk about everybody's favorite nobody, John Schofield.
J. Mick S.
John, as the fabled Ed Bars, only Bars could do it. Second only behind John McAllister Schofield was John C. Fremont, the bastard. he did not like Fremont, but he also didn't like Schofield, because I heard him say one time, Thomas Cartwright used to do this too. No man's back was safe when there was a knife in the hands of John McAllister Schofield, which is probably somewhat true because he was really silly after Franklin and criticizing Thomas. But who was John McAllister Schofield? Why don't you, the Southern-born graduate of a famous Louisiana university, tell us all about the man from...
It's not that famous.
Is it Jerry or Gary, New York? Is that where he's from?
I would say that it's Jerry, New York.
Jerry?
I'm
the
sure
Jerrys. It sounds like something out of World War II.
He's not in Battle of Britain, no. I've watched the movie a million times. He doesn't make it.
The Battle of Britain? There's a movie about that?
Yeah.
What's the Battle of Britain?
Never mind. All right. Sorry.
What do I know?
I just got a little...
Is that a naval fight or something?
It's the greatest air... No. Okay, we're not doing this. Anyhow, John Schofield, born in Jerry, New York. 1831?
I focus on the Civil War, son.
Of course you do. But goes off to Military Academy at West Point, graduates 1853.
How far was that? Was that like 10 miles from home?
I don't... How am I supposed to know that?
Well,
I don't know the mileage off the top of my
I thought you
head.
did some prep work.
I did some prep work on knowing who John
He
Schofield
took a
is.
paddle boat down the Hudson River to the famous academy.
Let's go ahead and say he did that, because that makes him sound a lot cooler than he was.
Do you think when he went to the academy, was he one of those guys? He had that big, thick, like head of hair,
No.
like almost like a white guy's afro.
No.
And then it all fell out, like when he was 25.
So Donald Connolly, his biographer, wrote...
Bella's in the background saying, "What's going on?"
She's dying. But he was apparently prematurely balding at like a super young age.
Schofield was?
Younger than 30.
Where did you read this?
There he is, right there.
Where did you read this?
Politics of Generalship by Donald Connolly. Which is one of only 2 biographies written on J.M. Mick. But Schofield graduates from the academy, same class as Hood.
53.
53. They've got the fun thing in common. They both have the same amount of demerits, all that other fun stuff.
That is fun, though. The demerits, for totally different reasons.
Absolutely.
Schofield gets the worst kind of demerits. Hood gets the fun one. Showing up late, smoking, dancing, all sorts
Schofield
of...
was almost kicked out of the... Actually, he was kicked out of the academy.
You know
he was
that when...
expelled
in the
and then had to be kind of brought back in.
You know, in the 1980s, John Bell Hood would have been listening to Guns N' Roses, and then John Schofield would still be listening to Boston or REO Speedwagon. There's a reference for some of you older guys. You know Hood would have way more fun.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But Schofield is kicked out of the academy.
Well, that's because he
Gets back in.
That's because he let somebody else do naughty things on the chalkboard, which is itself a crazy story, right?
Yeah.
It was like a weird hazing incident.
Yeah. And he's held responsible for it because he was the senior cadet. So he's kicked out and then brought back in. Graduates in 53. So he's a year behind where he should have been. But graduates with Hood, has a pretty, normal pre-war Army career. But in 1860, he takes a year off.
What does he do?
He's in the artillery. And he's shipped out west. Yeah, he's not an engineer. He's an artilleryman.
Where was he out west?
I don't remember. Not off the top of my head.
Gosh.
But
we can talk about Hood all day, but we're like Schofield. I don't know.
We'll wing it.
We'll wait.
But what I think is really interesting is that in 1860, he not necessarily resigns his commission, but he takes a year's leave. And he goes out to St. Louis, and that's where he is in 1861. But he's not a soldier. He's a teacher. He's at Washington University teaching applied mathematics and philosophy. Really super interesting stuff here, folks.
Wow.
He is really great. Anyhow, 1861 joins up with...
He's a college professor. How ironic.
Something to identify with.
Perhaps you should grow your beard out very long.
I just cut it off. I got tired of the 8-month-old grabbing and then letting all of her weight rip my beard out. So
Welcome to being a dad.
yeah, no beard, no problems. But Schofield in 61 joins up with the State Guard. He goes in with Nathaniel Lyon. He's in the Army of the Frontier fighting out west, but then Lyon is killed at Wilson's Creek.
Have you ever been there?
Yes.
What a great battlefield.
It is. And that it's one of those modern Park Service sites is really cool.
Ed Bars.
Too. Yeah.
That and Pea Ridge.
Yeah.
He helped save them.
And Pea Ridge is a great park. I think it's the best. Anyways.
Wilson's Creek is pretty amazing. Wilson's Creek is almost like just pristine.
Yeah. I think the same thing about Pea Ridge. Because when you get up in that observation deck and you look out, there's nothing modern for miles and miles and miles. You can't even see it. But Schofield is there when Lyon is killed, rides off to save the army effectively. That's how he would later remember it. But he at least holds back more federal troops from arriving on the battlefield into a chaotic situation, manages the retreat of the army, kind of finds his way to command the army of the frontier, and then does a really handed job. But then in 64, early 63, we've got a new army.
But he's a department commander too.
Right.
Which is important to note, I think, because that's how he ends up in command of the whole shooting match here. Mm-hmm. Because
at least he's got that over David Stanley.
Right. David Stanley and he are of the same rank.
Are we going to do an episode on David Stanley?
I don't know. We're doing one on Schofield right now.
I know, we should. Okay, anyhow.
So 64, he's corps commander, but really commander of the Army of the Ohio, which is a wing of Sherman's army.
Right. And some would argue the most utilized but least appreciated corps in Sherman's army.
They play a really interesting role in the Battle of Atlanta.
Yeah. Well, they're always out on the flanks. I mean, right. I guess because it is so small, you can send them out on these kind of forced marshes. Mm-hmm. But Schofield performs really, really well. And that doesn't mean necessarily that William Tecumseh Sherman is a big fan of John Schofield, because he's certainly not. He actually prefers who?
Well,
Jacob Cox.
Right.
Hard not to like Jacob Cox, though.
Well, when you have in your army George Henry Thomas, Jacob Cox, James McPherson, and John Schofield, you've got some
3 out of 4 ain't bad.
You've got some flash and results, but let's get into the Tennessee campaign, because time's ticking.
I'm sorry, he's just interesting. But he is placed in command of the 4th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland and the 23rd Corps of the Army of the Ohio, as essentially a delaying force. Get out in front of Hood, slow him down, buy Nashville time, which is really the objective for Schofield in the entire campaign. But he has big problems. First off, he's got to try and piece together this ad hoc army. 4th Corps is getting cycles of replacements. 23rd Corps is coming off the Atlanta campaign. They link up in Pulaski, only for him to find out that Hood's got the upper hand on him now and is closer to Columbia. So they start this all-out forced march up towards Columbia. And Schofield's got to try and really get his hands on a bigger problem, which is that he has no cavalry right now. James Wilson's off out on his own, essentially detached from Schofield. So he's moving. A lot of this stuff is being done by infantry intelligence and by kind of the, what you can see, line of sight. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where Schofield actually kind of shines, is in the beginning of the campaign. While, Hood's got him on the foot race to Columbia, he keeps finding little ways to make his situation at least sustainable.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that Spring Hill is the pinnacle, because what he does that night with the assistance of Stanley and Wagner and Cox and Ruger and all the division guys especially, is they slip away. Yeah. And they escape. And we'll talk about the Battle of Franklin, of course, in a future episode. He does a bunch of back channel stuff before the Battle of Nashville that I think really taints his legacy, because he's among these who's basically just complaining covertly that Thomas isn't moving fast enough, which sort of feeds some of, I think, Grant's anxieties at City Point about, let's finish Hood off. Mm-hmm. But I think it's good to finish with what Schofield did post-war, because his legacy isn't really just the Civil War. No, it's an important legacy.
I think the Civil War is still a baby.
It's West Point and Pearl Harbor that are his primary legacies. His work at West Point, his really reorganization and revolution of the U.S. Army.
Yeah, he professionalizes the Army.
Professionalizes it, outfits it really for what it was in the into World War I.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is I think his legacy is not so much just Pearl Harbor, but I think the Spanish-American War and the First World War.
Right.
You can see Schofield's fingerprints all over those.
So when I
armies.
mention Pearl Harbor, I'm talking about, so he does his hands-on work making the U.S. Army into a modern fighting force.
Right.
And then what he does is he chooses, and he had done this years before, he was
1872,
chose Pearl Harbor as a military base because America, it's fascinating to think about how fast we progressed after the Civil War. And he chose that location to protect against Japanese and Chinese incursions into American interests.
into the gateway for the United States to expand its power.
And my
in the
God,
Pacific.
70 years later, we know what happens at Pearl Harbor
Yep.
because of Japanese incursions into the South Pacific. And to this day in 2024, although Japan is now one of our greatest allies, we still deal with a Chinese threat. And it's not the threat that Schofield saw, but that's I think a legacy that is worth noting. So I think he's fascinating because he's that young man before the war, defends the Union, fights the war, but like so many, the Confederates never got this chance because, of course, their military careers were derailed. And so guys like Schofield, I think, are just hugely important in how they impact the post-war era and how they still impact us in a mostly positive way today.
Yeah.
Last thoughts on JMS?
No, I think that's a great way to end it.
S.
John McS.
All righty, so we're 4 episodes in, so we're barely at the halfway point. Now we're going to get to the good stuff in the episodes to come. We've got the real mechanics of the campaign and a lot of different characters and a lot of crazy action over several days at the end of November 1864. Thanks for watching.